Can Notre Dame pull off the upset against Georgia in the college football playoff? One insider thinks so, but you're going to want to hear what he has to say in our video presented by BetUS. Welcome back to College Football Addiction. The quarterfinals are upon us. Notre Dame and Georgia. We've got Joe back from the Rufino and Joe show to talk a little bit about this matchup. Joe, how you doing, bud?
I'm doing great. I'm certainly a little nervous. Need to see what happens with this Notre Dame Georgia game, and I'm just rooting for us to pull this one out.
Yeah, so obviously all the talk is around UGA's quarterback and the fact that Carson Beck won't be playing there. I'm 100% going to use that as a tease and talk about that in just a minute. But let's talk about Notre Dame first. Your esteemed colleague, Blake Rufino, was on a few days ago, and I asked him, I did tee this up for him. We gave him a hard time last time, so
okay.
I teed it up for him. I said, is there a playoff team that won last weekend that you're concerned about, that you're not as convinced, right? That you didn't think their performance was maybe as good as the rest? And he did say Notre Dame. He said, look, outside of that long run, the game was maybe a lot closer than people may have thought. Their defense played well, So anyway, do you want to defend that? Like, were you concerned? Like, of the four teams, do you think Notre Dame was maybe the least impressive that won? What are your thoughts around all that?
I thought that the least impressive team was Texas because in the second half, especially in the third quarter, there was actually a tangible weakness that showed up. Their secondary, their corners specifically, they gave up a ton of big gains down the sideline. Their boundary corners, their outside corners were not playing well against a young receiving corps for Clemson. That is something that's going to catch up to them against Ohio State and Oregon. I don't know how you can watch what Notre Dame did in the dominance that they had. And I know what Blake's going after because we had the same argument, and I'm surprised that he's still leaning on it. But they dominated on defense. The points they gave up were total garbage time points. It was not the same as what Texas did. They didn't mount the comeback because they were completely falling asleep. They put backups into the game. They gave up an onside kick with little time remaining, and that was what led to the score finishing closer than it was. The reason why Notre Dame didn't have success running the football, the one thing for Indiana that actually was their true strength was their run defense. If we look back at the way that they played against Ohio State, outside of Travion Henderson having a big game, and he had a couple of big gains that boosted his rushing total, Quinshon Judkins was completely removed from the equation. So we actually have an example of, even though they played poorly against Ohio State, we knew that they had the bodies on their D-line to at least slow down Notre Dame's rushing attack. Notre Dame this whole season hasn't just purely been, run the rock, grind you out, lean on on Janarian Price and Jeremiah Love. They have been a lot of big splash plays in the run game, and that has produced offensive success for them. Now, they do need to finish better in the red zone. I understand the concern there. They were getting a little bit complacent, and they were relying too much on field goals. But I'm not worried. I don't think that anything from that performance to me shows and says, the same Notre Dame, they look brutal. And of course, Blake found a way to pick Notre Dame in that conversation.
Well, to be fair to Blake, certainly he could not pick a Big 12 team that's cosplaying as an SEC team this year. And
fair.
What was he going to do there? So post Christmas Day shots, we're here for him. All right. So talking, maybe role playing off of some of what you just mentioned there, Georgia's defense, like how well do you think that that Notre Dame will be able to run the ball and move the ball against them? Obviously, at times they've shown a propensity to be really good defensively, and then other times they've certainly given some things up. What are your thoughts around how Notre Dame will move the ball this week?
Yeah, I think that Notre Dame has to find those splash plays in the run game because we saw what Georgia did both times they faced against Texas.
Appreciate BetUS for their support. We'll get right back to chatting with Joe. But first, if you are betting on any games this postseason or this bowl season, make sure you're doing so with BetUS. BetUS is offering a code right now that you can use of YouTube150 for a 150% sign-up bonus on your first deposit. But that's not it. You get 125% on your next two. All of that up to $2,000. Appreciate BetUS. Again, use code YouTube150 for your deposit bonus.
And I think that they're going to deploy a very similar game plan. The approach that they're going to be going for is make Riley Leonard beat them. They did that with Quinn Ewers. They said, Quinn Ewers, you better throw the ball 30, 40 plus times in this game, and you might go for over 300 yards, but we know that you're going to turn the ball over. We know that you're going to have an interception. You're going to have a fumble. You're going to take a bad sack. Whatever it was going to be, that was what ended up coming to fruition in those Texas matchups. And Notre Dame needs those splash plays. They're going to try and take away the run completely. I think that the big difference here, though, is that Notre Dame has more sustained success at running the football, and they have way bigger explosive plays. And I know Jaden Blue is a spark plug, and Trey Wisner is a good running back, but I think that Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price are better backs overall. That they can be super productive if they continue to lean on them and they don't abandon the run game early. It will, again, certainly come down to, can they produce something in the first quarter, second quarter, whatever it is, in order to give their offense momentum. Because if Riley Leonard has to do more than we're used to seeing, it's not going to end well for Notre Dame. If he has to throw over 30 passes and there's a lot of third and long situations, he's just not that type of guy. He's not that type of guy that is going to be able to win in those spots. Instead, he needs to be given 3rd and 4, 3rd and 5, the ability to scramble for short yardage, or like you showed in the Indiana game, find somebody like Jordan Faison to dump the ball off to, or Jeremiah Love or Mitchell Evans to keep the drive going.
Before anybody freaks out about this comparison, UGA obviously struggled earlier in the year with a mobile quarterback in Jalen Milroe. I am in no way comparing Riley Leonard's athleticism
Big
to Jalen
difference.
Milroe's, but could that be a factor? Could you mentioned kind of scramble on the 3rd and shorts? Can his mobility be a factor?
Absolutely, and I think that Notre Dame needs to pull up that film, and also the better comparison is what Haynes King did. Haynes
Sure.
King he's apparently a 4.5, 4.4 athlete. He's been, since he was at Texas A&M. A lot of people talked about how he could have been the fastest quarterback in the SEC and done all these crazy things, and he ends up doing it at Georgia Tech in a different degree. They need to utilize King and set him up in those passing situations to produce, but also let him run free as a scrambler. Let him and tell him, hey, man, if that first read's not there, don't hang in the pocket. Michael Williams or Jalen Walker is going to come hawking you down, and they're going to rip the ball from you, and they're going to come just full speed ahead at you. You need to just, if that first read's not there, trust your instincts, try and pick up those big plays. The way that they were able to utilize Georgia Tech Haynes King in that game, I think that there's so much that they can steal from it. And Jamal Haynes, who is a very underrated running back for Georgia Tech, who had an awesome game, there's comparisons that could be made between him and Jadarian Price. They got to find ways to get Price and Jeremiah Love worked into this running game the same exact way. The blueprint of how to beat Georgia, I think, is out there. I know that it's rivalry weekend, and a lot of people always say, like, we got to just throw out the tape rivalry weekend. That's fair. The emotions are running high. Georgia's going to be a lot more prepared, and they're not going to give up those same plays. But at the same time, if there were weaknesses and a lot of leaky performances against a similar style quarterback, they have to try and recreate that success.
I thought that Georgia did a good job and their opponents did a poor job, a mix of both, of really, really playing bend don't break. And when they got in the red zone, teams just did not finish well against them. You look back at the Kentucky game where Kentucky absolutely should have put that game away earlier. I look back at the SEC championship, had Texas converted a little bit more in the red zone, not only late in the game, but early in the game. If they'd have gone to the half with a 13-point lead and then the backup comes in, like, I don't really think there's any chance in, that Georgia's coming back in that situation, although doubting Kirby Smart is probably never smart on my end. But just for all intent and purposes, but you mentioned that as a struggle that Notre Dame does need to finish better there. And it just feels like if Notre Dame has the opportunities in the first half and doesn't take advantage of them, we know that Kirby's so good at halftime adjustments, maybe the best in college football. If Notre Dame leaves points out on the field in the first half multiple times, as we saw with Kentucky, as we saw with Texas, as we've seen with other teams, that is an absolute recipe to have Georgia come back in the second half and win this game.
No, I completely agree. Notre Dame doesn't win this game if they don't finish their drives off. I mean, I'm not going to go as crazy to say that they need to go 100% in the red zone, but they need to be like close to that. They need to have a very high success rate of converting in the red area, and it's something that Notre Dame has had inconsistencies of throughout the season. One of the things that I talked about after the Indiana game, they can't do that against Georgia. They just can't get all the way down the field, march down the field, have a bunch of nice layup plays that just churns the drives through, and then get down there, stall, and then kick a field goal. They can't do that against a team like Georgia. You're not going to win against a premier team by kicking field goals. That is, you just talked about here. That is how Georgia, when their offense has not stepped up to the plate, where they've had some of their worst offensive performances, that's how they've survived. That's how they've stayed afloat, because they know that if the game ends up coming down to a final drive and it is 13-13 or it's 13-10 and Notre Dame needs to go down and score a touchdown, they know that Glenn Schumann and the defensive coaching staff and that defensive rotation is going to step up and stop them when they need to make those plays.
So the other side is the offensive side for Georgia. Notre Dame's defense, obviously great against Indiana and really been playing pretty well as of late and for much of this year. The thoughts on Georgia's offense has certainly struggled. They've got a backup quarterback in, nothing away from Texas's defense, but Georgia's offense struggled in that first half against Georgia Tech. That Georgia Tech defense, and again, I understand it's rivalry weekend, but at the end of the day, you're still just out there making plays, and their offense very much struggled. They have a new quarterback in right now. I know there's a lot of excitement around Stockton. I even heard Freeman talk about how talented he thinks he is, and he certainly is a talented player, but the thoughts on that matchup of Georgia's kind of middling at times. Offense is not a typical Georgia offense that we've seen. Obviously, doesn't have the skill positions that they're used to out wide. Can Notre Dame keep them under 20, 24 points in this matchup?
I think they need to, and I think a lot of Notre Dame fans realize that that's the path to success, is that they need to play a great defensive game. And it's not like it's out of the realm of capability for them. It's not like they need to go play elite perfect defense. They need to play their style of ball, which is playing great physical play at the line of scrimmage, and they need to play really tight coverage in man-to-man situations and win at the catch point. We know that Georgia struggles with run blocking. They had a really good second half in the SEC championship game, but they had a lot of issues throughout the year in some of their worst games where they're giving up penetration to defensive linemen. Notre Dame's defensive linemen are built, I think, to have success and generate tackles for loss against Trevor Etienne and company. But what now becomes a concern is that Notre Dame's biggest mauling defensive tackle, Riley Mills, is out for the playoffs. He's done for the rest of the season. Not having him, I think, is going to be worrying, especially knowing that Notre Dame has had to rely on a bunch of different younger players at other position groups. It's been a next man up season at defensive back, at defensive end, and now at defensive tackle. Can Gabriel Rubio and all these other players, Heinisch, whoever steps up in the rotation, can they play to a high level? There's that hope that we've seen production from those players at other position groups, that Notre Dame's just so well coached and that the depth is there, which has been, again, a calling card, but it's a question mark. I think one thing also that really plays well to Notre Dame's strengths is dealing with a receiving core for Georgia that has so many drops and that is so inconsistent in wide open situations. They're dropping the ball when they have got wide open spacing and they can just turn it upfield and get a first down. And it has been the biggest storyline for this Georgia offense. Can Notre Dame, and I think that they can Leonard Moore and Christian Gray, who are great coverage corners that are great at the catch point, can they disrupt the ball coming in those tight windows? That is going to be super important. And then the last part about this, you mentioned Gunnar Stockton. He is either going to be a huge catalyst because he brings a different level, a different fold to the offense that Carson Beck didn't. He is willing to run and he's willing to scramble. He's willing to tuck it and run upfield, up the middle of a defense that requires Notre Dame to have their head on a swivel and maybe even put a spy on him that is going to take away from the rest of their defenders. Or he comes in and he's an inexperienced quarterback and he ends up throwing an interception to Xavier Watts. His performance, I think, is going to be the biggest shift and the biggest just swing for the outcome of this game offensively for Georgia.
Yeah, it makes it such a question mark because, yes, he's had 3.5 weeks to get ready. There's certainly a lot of talent there. There's a lot of talent around him, maybe not as much as a typical UGA team, but they're still very talented. And so it's so hard to know if maybe his mobility, maybe just his gunslinger mentality gets them up and going, or if he throws a horrible pick like he did that nearly went back for a pick six and gave Texas the SEC championship. And so it is now he's had more time to work. He obviously didn't expect to play in that game. There are some different factors going on. But again, that is the entire, what does Pate say? Like, if you could tell me the stat now of how he plays, like, I'll tell you who wins this game. And that's the most obvious, maybe, deduction that anyone's ever had in any kind of sports analysis. But he is such a question mark, and I don't even mean that as a bad way for the UGA folks watching. Like, yeah, there's a lot of promise, there's a lot of hope. He might be the guy for next year, all those things, but nobody really knows how he's going to play on this stage as a starter in a quarterfinal in a big bowl game that is win or go home. And so, yeah, I don't even know how you start to analyze that, how you start to break that down, because to me, it's just the biggest question. It might be the biggest question mark of the entire week. Like, the biggest question mark left in the playoffs is how does it, we know about what Quinn's going to do. We know about what Will Howard or Gabriel or Jeremiah, we know what these guys are going to do. No one has any idea truly what Stockton does when he gets out there.
Maybe this is me putting too much pressure onto the situation and him specifically, but I believe that he needs to play near perfect. Like, he can't turn the ball over. And the reason why I say that is Notre Dame's safeties specifically. Their safeties are awesome at turning the ball over. They are, and more specifically, they're not just guys that have been merchants of balls hanging out in, wide open areas for them to just make easy plays on the ball. They are extremely decisive and reactive, and they are the best safeties in the country of making plays on the ball in risky situations when opposing quarterbacks take a risk that really isn't there. I know that they're not going up against a ton of premier quarterbacks, but they have exploited any slightly, like, even if it's a slight risk, any slightly risky decision by a quarterback, they have taken advantage of it with Xavier Watts and Adon Schuler. They have made some really game-shifting plays. So Gunnar Stockton, he can maybe get away with one, but they can't give short fields to Notre Dame. They just can't. That is what is allowing for and will create success for Notre Dame offensively, is if they end up in those situations where, they start off the drive and he's taking pressure and he tries to throw the ball into a tight window, and out of nowhere, Xavier Watts comes down and hawks the football. He has been back-to-back seasons one of the best ball hawking safeties, a former receiver that has gotten better year by year, that could have a huge print on this game.
Better hands, Xavier Watts or all of UGA's wide receiver core?
Georgia fans, would you argue with me? Xavier Watts probably has better hands than all of them. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say. He's a former receiver. It's not like he's just some random dude out there that's gotten lucky.
All right, here's the big one. How are you leaning in this one? Do you think Notre Dame pulls it off? What's your heart, head, all this say?
I've been sticking with Notre Dame just because I try not to be fanboyish on any of the stuff that I do and any of the content that I do or the guest appearances. But I have said, whenever I've gotten asked this question, I have to still stick with Notre Dame. I'm not going to go against my team. I think that if they do win the game, it's going to be like a 17-14 game or a 20-16 game. It is going to be incredibly low scoring. I would be stunned if this thing ends up exploding for big offensive production, but it is probably going to come down to a final drive, a late field goal, whatever it is. I don't see either team going over 24 points.
Should be a fun one. Should be closer than the blowout fest that we had in the first round.
Yeah.
But we are certainly excited for it. Joe, where can people follow you? Where can they find more of your content and work?
You can catch me on Twitter at Joe DeLeon, and then be sure to check out the Ruffino and Joe show with my co-host Blake Ruffino, who I'm sure there will be plenty of yelling about Notre Dame in the coming weeks.
Can't wait for it. Thanks, buddy. Appreciate Joe for joining us. And again, appreciate BetUS for their support. Make sure you're betting with them through this college football playoff and bowl season.